Thank you all for joining in. A good evening and a good morning for folks joining out of Eastern Time Zone as well as Pacific. Today we are gathered here primarily to look at some of the work that has been delivered by the coordinated efforts of teams from Gramener, Seeds, and Microsoft. And we're proud of the work that we were able to work on and the value we will be able to realize on the ground for the last 1 year. And this conversation is a representation of how we feel about the kind of work that has gone in. And we want to share our experience with the larger audience who are participating today. And with also an intention that to demonstrate how when intent which is strong enough and driven by passion, the solution follows while it not be immediate with the right pressure of intent and need and right combination of technology and perseverance, how impact can be created in tougher problem areas as well. So welcome all for this webinar. I am Sandeep Reddy Malu. I represent the ESG domain in Gramener along with the data science practice. And along with me, I have a lovely panel today, Dr. Anshu Sharma from Seeds, Tina Sedelholm from Microsoft, excuse me, from Microsoft AI for Good. She's a senior program manager there. And we have Cameron Birch, senior program manager, humanitarian partnerships at Microsoft. Welcome you all for the webinar, and thank you for making your time for us today. Let's go ahead with a quick round of introductions. Anshu, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Sandeep. Great pleasure being here with all of you. My name is Anshu Sharma. I'm joining today from Delhi. I'm a co-founder and I work with an organization called Seeds, which is a non-profit working in the area of disaster preparedness and response in India and across South Asia. And by training, I'm an urban planner, and I sit here applying my mind on how to do things better. That's my role in the organization. Sandeep?
Good. That was a humble introduction, Anshu. May I also share joy that Seeds has won the Subhash Chandra Bose Apada Pradhan Puraskar for the year 2021. That's a national level recognition in India. The honors were given by Prime Minister Modi, and Anshu was the recipient of that award on behalf of Seeds for 3 decades of efforts in disaster preparedness and resilience among vulnerable sections of the country. So thank you for that dedication, Anshu. 30 plus years of work is a lifetime, and that's a brilliant example of passion doing in day every day. Thank you for that, Anshu.
Thanks, Sandeep.
Tina, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yeah, I'm Tina Sederholm, and I'm with Microsoft's AI for Good Research Lab. We do work across a number of different pillars, including health and accessibility, and in this case, for this project, humanitarian action.
Thank you, Tina. Cameron, would you like to introduce yourself?
Great, thank you, Sandeep. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As mentioned earlier, I'm calling in from Seattle, the lovely Pacific Northwest. As Sandeep mentioned, I work with Microsoft. I'm on the philanthropy team. I manage our global humanitarian response work and also our initiatives around humanitarian action, which in this case is the AI for Humanitarian Action program. So wonderful to be here and talk about a project that we're very proud of, and it's been exciting to be on this journey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cameron. Let's get started. India has a long coastal line, and which means the cyclone season every year has a repeated pattern of making landfall and causing destruction. One of the recent examples from history is Cyclone Amphan in the Bay which originated in the Bay of Bengal and had an impact on states of West Bengal adjoining Orissa and more damage in the country of Bangladesh. According to the State of Climate 2020 report released by the UN, the Amphan cyclone alone had a damage of 14 billions in areas where it had landfall and impact. That's devastating. 14 billion is a big number. And if you pair off the big ticket numbers, what you realize is Amphan resulted in devastation of close to 2.9 million houses, which were destroyed, uprooted, or were made inhabitable. There were, in some areas, the low-lying areas, there were close to 15 feet of inundation in low-lying areas. And some of these areas received rainfall that was in excess of 200 millimeters in a single day, like suburban areas of Alipur and West Bengal. It's a suburb of Calcutta. So this is a level of destruction that has a repeating pattern. And India as a whole, the numbers for 2020 are close to $35 billion worth of damage caused by cyclones across the coast, the Arabian coast as well as the Bay of Bengal coast. And that is one of the reasons why disaster preparedness and post-disaster recovery becomes a key thing, because communities and impacted citizens in these areas, it is not a one-off instance, it's a cyclic event, which means the next year you see similar patterns playing out. And that is the context of why the nature of the projects that we have collectively worked on, and the reason why it is such a big pain area. It's not a one-off event, it's a recurring event. And with that context, let's start with Anshu. Anshu, from your experience of working with seeds, could you talk about the seeds journey, and how did this idea of how do we minimize damage come into play? While the primary focus has been on post-disaster recovery, how did the idea come in to look at reducing it at the source? So could you take us through the journey?
Yeah, Sandeep, thanks. And thanks for those very alarming figures that you shared. Uh, for us, there's two parts to this journey. One, of course, is so Seeds started from a very academic background at the School of Planning and Architecture with my colleagues. We just thought of doing some stuff, sticking our necks out, and basically starting with some action research on the ground. And this was the early and mid 90s, with events of floods unfolding around us at that time. And two things that are very striking, and you use some very big numbers, I'll probably use some as we move ahead with this conversation, but two very striking things. One is that, of course, numbers when you're there, when you're standing in the midst of people and seeing death and destruction, numbers suddenly hit you as something very sterile. They lose the human face of that disaster. Very large numbers actually start making you numb and insensitive to what's happening. So the number versus the human face and story game was one that was very relevant. The second thing that struck us was that a lot of these losses, in fact, most of the losses, up to 90% of the losses, are private and they are uninsured. So they don't get captured in formal losses properly. You may see, and there have been so many instances, the South Asian tsunami wiped out populations on the coastline, fishing communities, their livelihoods, their assets, not a blip on the GDP, because all of this is happening below the formal net where you capture stuff, where formal economies get accounted for. So the unaccountedness of this loss was so huge that we really felt the urge to do something in those communities, in those places which are literally below the radar. So we came from a background of architecture and planning. So there was an inherent skill set which was around building, which still continues to be a primary focus of our work. We do post-disaster reconstruction, we do assessments around buildings. But then what really was driving us was to peel these layers off and see where individuals are getting hit and how steps can be taken to make that story a little better. Sandeep?
That's helpful to understand, Anshu. And while the intent exists, could you talk about what were the different challenges that you and your team had to encounter, Anshu? Or if you could share some anecdotes about how what you thought was a logical thing to do, but the kind of turbulence and the kind of bumps you encounter, that would help us put this into perspective.
Actually, I think the challenge story is very long. Probably you hit one success after 20 challenges and failures that you go through. But I think if I try to break this down into very simple terms, then the the first set of things that really that we struggled with was I think best explained by a quote. I remember a quote from one of our teachers, a professor called Nabil Hamdi. He said, "I see what I see, but I don't know what I'm looking at." And when we are on the ground in these contexts, that's exactly what starts happening to you. So in fact, we'll talk in a moment about the project also, and that story went back to 2019. recent years when we are standing in front of an urban slum, a very large urban slum on the east coast, devastated by a cyclone, and you're seeing there's a large number of houses which have completely been destroyed. There are some that are partly damaged. There are some that are uh, in pretty good shape, So now you stand there, and then a moment later it hits you that the pattern is very predictable. It's if we were to see this and then go to any other similar context in a coastal community, it's very doable. It's very easy to figure out who's most vulnerable even without getting into detailed surveys. But then the wherewithal to do it, and with the wherewithal, the first problem that comes is of scale. As you said, the numbers are running into millions. We are right now having figures of 300 million people who are on the front lines of the climate emergency just in India. Two-thirds, now there's visible stuff which is around floods and cyclones that we talked about, but then two-thirds of these are people who will be exposed to extreme heat. And heat is a new emerging event, and it's not just about India. It's not just about the poor. We've seen in recent years in the US, in Canada, in Europe, Australia, all over this subcontinent, the invisibility of this disaster. So at one level, it seems like a very logical thing to figure out and be able to help people. But at another level, the scale is so huge and their invisibility is such a barrier that it's extremely frustrating. So I would say, in terms of challenges, the question that you posed, Sandeep, the first and the biggest challenge is the invisibility of the people who are really getting hit. A second challenge is the scale at which they are dispersed. And then we can talk a little more about the third challenge, which is about finding the right solutions which would be appropriate for them. So it's very easy to come from outside with a utopian kind of a solution that works very well in theory. But as they say, things we do in practice don't always work in theory. So it doesn't work the way you want it to work on the ground. And that's something that needs to be understood, unraveled to a great degree. Sandeep?
Great insight, Anshu. To humanize the pain, it's never enough to look at it as numbers alone. Well said. You talked about two hazards, Anshu. Cyclone was one and heat wave. Are there any such other hazards, Anshu, that you talked about a number of 300 million citizens in India being affected by climate, right? What other
Yeah.
hazards would you think are going to create more friction for these vulnerable communities in the future?
So Sandeep, I think that these two come into play because they're the ones we've worked on in these last year and a half, and to also share with our audience, the reason for starting out with floods was that uh, we were trying to develop a proof of concept, and to prove your concept, you actually needed a disaster. And the only certain disaster, while there's a fair amount of certainty around rainfall and flooding, which happens in a particular period, the monsoons on the subcontinent, but there also the areas are very wide. You don't know exactly where it would happen, and with limited resources, we had to really work with very narrow areas of interest where we would concentrate our inquiry. Now we don't know that. Now the only disaster which is of a very high certainty is a flood induced by a cyclone. And let me also share that there's a huge myth. The image that people get in their minds when the word cyclone is taken is of very high wind speeds and devastation with that. But the impact of cyclones happens because of flooding. It's the cyclone induced floods that destroy assets. Most of the deaths in cyclones are from drowning. So we know for sure that if there is a very well projected forecast of a cyclone track, we know where the flood is going to hit with a lead time of about a week, 5 days to 7 days. So we've literally been chasing cyclones these last 2 years to be there when the flood strikes. And so the first one from the hazard point of view was cyclone induced floods, and then the invisibility hit us, so we moved to heat waves. But then here on the story changes. So it's not just hazards. We are now more inclined to chase vulnerability, which is the other side of the disaster equation, because a hazard in itself may not lead to a disaster. For example, if an earthquake happens and everyone's either in a safe building or you're out in the open, then there will be no losses. In fact, Charles Richter, after whom the Richter scale is named, has this famous quote. He said that earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do, right? And good buildings don't kill people. It's the poorly built or poorly maintained buildings. So now, instead of chasing earthquakes, we are chasing poorly built or maintained buildings, and that's what the next inquiry. So of course we are working on earthquakes, but here onwards, instead of just looking at the range of hazards, we are looking at the range of impacts that happen. So there's impacts on agriculture, which could be of a drought or heat or fires or floods. We are looking at impacts on livelihoods, even COVID induced work. So in part, we've tried to use this model in the context of how micro enterprises were hit during the COVID lockdown. These are informal sector enterprises, a few people working together who were really badly hit. So how do you start looking at those? So in that sense, Sandeep, the track is changing a bit. We are chasing use cases which are more based on vulnerability now onwards. Sandeep?
That's insightful, Anshu. Thank you for walking us through the whole idea of how do you identify what areas to focus on, which is quite challenging in its own, given that there are so much that you could attempt and do, and then narrowing down to focus areas. With that, let's look, Cameron, when we talk about climate action, and Microsoft has been at the forefront of enabling action using technology through multiple programs like AI for Humanitarian Action and other Microsoft initiatives. Could you elaborate on some of the initiatives that you have been part of and how Microsoft looks at addressing and assisting solutions in the climate space?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk to our work, and then I can also mention a lot of work going on with one of our sister teams, which is quite exciting. So we are one of 5 sisters in Microsoft under the AI for Good portfolio. And there's AI for Earth, and AI for Humanitarian Action, AI for Health, AI for Cultural Heritage. I think I got them all. That's 5. And we focus on enabling organizations that provide humanitarian assistance or preparedness to do so. And so we focused on 4 pillars: disaster response, needs of women and children, human rights, and refugees and displaced persons. And we were established about 4 years ago, and with this mandate to identify projects that move the needle in this space. And we've ended up with 58 projects in 19 countries and over 23,000 man hours, providing our expertise on the data science side, Azure grants, and then bringing in partners to really help organizations as well. Gramener is a good example of how important partners are in this space, where they bring in the additional skill sets and really help organizations on the day-to-day work that needs to happen. And Sandeep, as you were mentioning, it's part of a larger umbrella. Microsoft has made a very large investment in sustainability and our work towards the environment and climate impacts, and to the point of trying to establish, not only do we want to be carbon neutral, we plan to be carbon negative, which is taking out all the carbon Microsoft's ever produced since its foundation in 1975 and remove it out of the atmosphere and out of circulation. And then at the same time, enabling works with other organizations and other areas that Microsoft works in, not only to mitigate the impact of what we're responsible for, but looking at the entire line, all the way from our suppliers down to our customers, and what roles and responsibilities do we have there. And on the humanitarian action side, like how do we help organizations like SEEDS and with Dr. Anshu, better prepare a more resilient society as things unfortunately are going to be changing. So back to you, Sandeep.
Oh, carbon negative, that's quite an ambitious goal. While most of the organizations are getting carbon neutral in 2030, 2050, it's very encouraging and refreshing to see how Microsoft is looking at carbon negative. That's a new thing I learned, Cameron. Thank you. You talked about different projects and gave out numbers of how number of projects that were identified. Could you dwell a little about how Microsoft looks at which projects to fund? While I'm presuming that you have a large pool of organizations applying for grants, that's a tough battle to even consider every request. So could you give us a lens of how the evaluation happens and how the selection is generally looked at?
Yes, and so we, in the last two rounds of project identification, we actually went to an open call model. Previously, it was more based on our bilateral relationships with organizations, our customers, other partners. The last two rounds, we finally opened it up and said, any organization, at first it was only nonprofits, but now open to universities and private sector, to submit projects and their ideas, again, under the 4 pillars. And then we look at it with a number of different lenses. I take it apart on the program side. How is this going to impact others around the world? How does this impact the overall humanitarian space? Does it meet some of our objectives? A lot of people apply just to, in the hope that some project they wish that doesn't align gets noticed. And then we rely heavily on Tina and the data science team, and they're going to look at the data side. Like, is this appropriate? Is the data there? Is this the right solution to be pursuing? And then together we iterate and then decide on our top ones and how to invest. And we have a range of investments. We have some very light ones. For example, Azure only. The India Institute of Technology has an Azure only grant, and they have just run with it. And for those in India, you might be familiar, vaccine cards in many locations are just manual papers, but it's standardized. So they created an OCR capture. They can glean all the data off the card quite quickly and create a health record. And so that way you get all the data quite quickly. And they ran with it because they knew what they were doing and were very good at it. To larger investments such as like Seeds and other organizations where we come in multilaterally and help bring additional resources. So yeah, we have we sit down, really narrow down, and then we can basically select what category or what path to take forward with an organization, all depending on the project. So it's been exciting. Thank you, Sandeep.
That's very helpful to understand. Then let's look at the Sunny Lives project, Cameron. Could you talk about your experience while you had seen this proposal for the first time, then how the program has been executed, and what do you aspire for in the future for this project, Cameron?
Well, to talk about Seeds and the proposal just from the beginning, it's really the type of project that we like to see. And for those who are listening to this webinar or listening to the recording, what is very important to us is this was clearly Seeds project. This is clearly designed well by Dr. Anshu and his colleagues. And what I mean by that is we sometimes get proposals where an organization has a problem and then tries to just throw it at us and say, hey, can you just sort out this problem and sprinkle some technology on it and let us know when you're done? And those aren't good fits. Whereas in the case of Seeds and the Sunny Lives project, it was well thought out. There was a clear project there. There was a clear gap analysis in the sense of, hey, this is what we're not good at, and we would like Microsoft to come in and here, and this is the role Gramener plays to help sponsor us. And we were able to follow their vision, which makes it much easier in the engagement on our side and allows the organization to focus on what they're good at and allows us to focus on what we're good at, and allows Gramener to focus on what they're good at the same time, it being owned and navigated by Seeds. And so that is the kind of engagements we seek out. We unfortunately probably don't get them as enough as we would like, but those are our objectives. And as far as the next steps, and Seeds in the Sunny Lives project has been a big influence there. We are going to be changing our approach a little bit. Instead of just an open call for any project, we're going to start shifting a little bit to have more targeted outcomes based on a request for proposal models. And Seeds has influence there. And we're going to start looking more around resiliency work globally, and then also on our damage assessment work. We've had some success with the Netherlands Red Cross, Unit 510. We've helped upgrade their damage assessment model. We're having some success here in the United States. If we bring these successes to a more cohesive whole and help, again, move the whole sector, but using this project as a good example of what's possible and where AI is appropriate. That's one last thing I just want to finish off with. Not every project should, could, or can be an AI project. It is a very good technology when applied well. However, it needs to have the right problem set. It needs to have the right data. It needs to be monitored. They can't always be trusted. And so how do you keep humans in the loop to help make on the ground decisions? Again, where Seeds has a lot of success there. And so where can we though apply this appropriately in those two areas? And a lot of that thinking has come from the success here. So it's been exciting. So thank you. Back to you, Sandeep.
Thank you, Cameron. Wonderful to hear that. Two takeaways from what you said. While you have proposals, but you do have a criteria to pick projects, the success of a project again is dependent on getting the data right and the gap analysis right and the execution depth. And that sounds exactly like how a commercial enterprise or anyone who's trying to apply data science and ride the hype wave would encounter, which means the evaluation criteria of a success is definitely a high bar. It is not just looked at as applying technology. I like how you put it, sprinkling technology on top. Wonderful. Thank you for that detailed walkthrough, Cameron. That's definitely helpful to understand how initiatives get looked at, evaluated, then grants extended, and then how it's monitored. Tina, let's look at how the execution part starts. And once Cameron's team looks at the grants, and then we get to the Microsoft AI for Good research team, could you talk about your team and how projects are planned, Tina, as part of your team's charter?
Yeah. So as Cameron mentioned, we have a number of AI for Good pillars. And the AI for Good Research Lab, once a project is identified and has a clear path to use data and has met those data readiness criteria, then we can engage our research scientists. And our research scientists will come in and help build models to address a specific problem. And so I'll talk a little bit about the SEEDS project and the work that we did there. So when we partnered with SEEDS, we understood that there was the need for data on the neighborhood level in order to determine the specific vulnerabilities and reduce risks in those areas. And so the SEEDS team had sourced satellite imagery from low-income and vulnerable areas in India. And what we did was come in with a research scientist to use that imagery to help build a machine learning model. And with that was where we partnered with Gramener and SEEDS to have that satellite imagery labeled with specific attributes so that we could build that machine learning model. So for instance, we identified different roof types, and we had from a study of houses in Mumbai and Puri and the different construction methods, we had originally identified 12 different roof types and then narrowed it down to 7 for specific risk categories. And the things that we looked at when we were building those labels in order to sort of feed that data to build an AI and machine learning model is that what material is that roof built from? And we use that material as the proxy for the strength of the structure. So for instance, a plastic sheet or a thatched roof would have a high probability of having mud walls, which would make the entire structure weak. And an iron or tile roof was interpreted as having masonry walls, but with mud mortar, which is still a bit weaker. And then a reinforced concrete roof would have concrete walls and a strong foundation. So based on the labels that we used for these houses in the satellite imagery, we were able to build that machine learning model that categorizes houses from satellite imagery into those specific categories. And narrowing down to those 7 categories allows for simplicity, which supports having clear instructions after a cyclone, during a crisis. So we built that in a way that could support the work that SEEDS is doing on the ground.
That's quite helpful, Tina. Tina, you talked about building these machine learning models and enabling that model to create impact on the ground. Two questions that we had got from participants who had registered was are the results of this work published? Where could we see these results? And the interest in this space essentially is folks would like to replicate the results of the model and learn from it. So Could you help us with these two aspects of the model building?
Yeah, and I want to expand a little bit on how our machine learning model was combined with the work from Gramener. So we built the model for the rooftop identification as the proxy for strength of the structure, but that was combined with the Gramener statistical model for risk scoring for that broader disaster vulnerability assessment system. And the entire pipeline was deployed in India in 2020, and we collected post hoc ground truth data and validated that the model and the risk scoring that was done by Gramener was working well. We had really good results with that. We did publish a paper internally at Microsoft, so Microsoft research teams have been able to access the results of those of the work that we did in the machine learning concepts. And in the coming months, the team will be publishing an external paper that shares the detail behind that machine learning model.
That would be pretty helpful, given the kind of approaches that are being done in coastal regions. Like Bangladesh is a country which is affected by floods, Cambodia, and any such open source and information being made available could help those communities replicate the same results at a much lower threshold compared to the learning curve that we went through. Talking about learning curve, Anshu, when we started off on the project, we had Microsoft backing, Gramener was on board. Walk us through what all challenges we got into, Anshu. While the initiation was good, and once we started going through the journey, we ran into a series of bumps in the road. So we want to call out some of those, Anshu. Okay, Anshu, can you hear us?
Yeah, Sandeep.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I can, Sandeep. Yeah. So no, without any doubt, it's been a bumpy road. I think for everything that's worked out, there have been 9 points of failure, or things that we've had to redo, including teams at Microsoft Data Science and Gramener. But I think if I recall just 2 or 3 of those moments which really stand out in my memory, one of course has been that what Tina just explained as a process is a highly simplified version for the purpose of sharing with the audience here. There's a lot more that was going on within each of the steps that Tina enumerated. But then still, as a concept, it works really well. And then the moment you get into the science of building engineering, then there could be questions around that, around how you can use rooftop as a proxy for much more that's going on in a building.
Right.
Sandeep, am I still with you?
Yes, Anshu, you were a bit away,
Yeah,
but now
no,
you're
my
back.
screen froze for a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So proxy, and that basically meant a very intensive ground truthing to be done. So we had feet on the street, people moving around. For every labeling exercise that we did for every round, we went down to the ground and actually checked things out so that we can feed the loop back and the learning can happen within the model and the system. Sandeep?
That's helpful, Anshu. So could we talk about some of the impacts that we have been able to create on the ground, Anshu, by applying the collective solution for predictive risk scoring?
Yeah. Okay. So I had a blip in my connection again, so I was just checking that we are all here. So yeah, Sandeep. Now, if we talk of these challenges, stuff that we had to do a reality check with on the models, then on the ground, feed it back, and then we are trying to also work on 2 tracks. So one track is to have a model that is accurate, where we are able to get results from this exercise. The other track is to see how it is impacting lives on the ground. That's eventually that's where for Microsoft as a philanthropic exercise, and for Seeds as a social organization, the real proof of what we've been able to create lies. And so for this, to help our audience understand this, Sandeep, I'll take a step back to just explain how things have been happening, how they still happen, because it's still early days. We haven't made a huge change in practice with this model yet. So what happens is, and I'll take the example of a cyclone, and I'll take the example again of Puri on the East Coast, where this whole story started, where we first approached Microsoft seeking help for this project. So when there is a cyclone warning on our coast, we basically take steps to save lives. The first priority is lives, saving lives. And over the past few years, we've got really, the Met department has got really good at forecast. So we get a very accurate forecast about a week in advance. Now, when you got a forecast that a major cyclone is approaching, what do? You evacuate people, right? How many people do you evacuate? Typically you evacuate 1 million people, right? You evacuate in the hundreds of thousands, but a number of times every year on the East Coast and once or twice on the West Coast of India, we are evacuating 1 million plus people. And once again, Sandeep, 1 million is a figure. It's a figure with a lot of numbers, but who are these million people? There are people who are very scared to leave their homes behind because people will break in, things will get stolen. There are people who are currently COVID positive and their families. There are people with disabilities. There are infants and their mothers. There are pregnant women who are to deliver in the next couple of days, and they will be in a relief shelter suddenly. There are women with their periods, and that's something which you don't see, but it is horror stories that once you start unraveling things, then you find in these relief shelters where people are going to be taken. So on the whole, it's fine. You're saving lives, so you don't worry about inconveniences, and you just truck people and put them in these schools, cyclone shelters, and other safer buildings. But still, you are evacuating 1 million people, and our first question is, do all of them need to be evacuated? Because what our understanding of buildings tells us, when we stand there and we look at these settlements, what we see and what the model tells us is that some of these families need to be evacuated. Some of these families can be moved to safer buildings within their neighborhoods. Some of these families are actually fairly all right in their buildings, and they can well stay there with certain precautions put into place. So if we are able to rationalize and break things down, then the whole process of responding to an emergency warning or a real emergency can be simplified, which can make lives much easier for the people who are being affected by this. That's like one part of it. The second part of it would be that if you evacuated people and there are 1 million people over the next week or 10 days in relief shelters, it is possible to know who they are, where they are from, what very specific individual challenges they are facing, so that we can customize relief. So the way we do a blanket evacuation, we also do blanket relief. There is a coastal community that has been hit, get them food, get them water, get them clothes, get them shelter and beddings. But then each family, each individual has very specific needs, and with the technology available to us and with the understanding of the context that we have built over the years, including governments and local authorities and local civil society organizations, it is possible to customize individual solutions so that you can cater to individual needs. So that's the impact that we are chasing, Sandeep. So this long winding answer to your impact question is because then it kind of tells you how calibrated, how granular, and how high resolution the actual relief work can be using these methods. And this year we've in the couple of events, the hazards that we were chasing, floods and cyclones, we've reached out to about 30,000 families. It's still not being rolled out as a program. It's a scaled testing that we've been doing, but the results are really heartwarming. And there have been individual stories, a woman in the fishing community who could salvage her little business because she got a very accurate warning, down to a cyclone in South India where we could go to the ground to do a ground truthing, and literally when the model told us, it identified individual houses that would see damage, and our ground team was telling us that 9 out of 10 predictions of the model were coming true. And initially we were a little stunned. We said, no, that's too good to be true. We were starting from a model that was detecting 60% of the buildings right, and then we bumped it up to 70 with all the work that our data science colleagues from your teams, Tina and Sandeep, they had done. And suddenly we are finding impact being so accurate on the ground. We had to go and recheck, but then that's where it was. So the logic is so clean, and of course, I'm not claiming that we're there, because there are things we are not right now measuring. For example, the degree of impact, the degree of damage. We are not measuring right now the intensity of the flood or the cyclone. So there's a lot of improvement to be done. There's a long way that's in front of us ahead. But just to give a flavor of how logical it is. In fact, sometimes I wonder why this was not done by anyone before this.
Right.
But it's there in front of us, and it's giving these kind of individually customized, designed impacts. Sandeep?
Truly, Anshu, we did have those surprises when we had applied model last year in 2020 in southern states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, Cyclone Yaas and Cyclones and Nivar, when we had identified the path of the cyclone, and we had grabbed the latest imagery for these regions, applied the model. And for context, the overall risk scoring model that Tina had talked about, the modeling exercise is step one, where you identify the rooftops, the 7 different types of rooftops. Then there are a series of GIS layers of information. There is a digital elevation model, there is a nearest roadways, there is a nearest vegetation NVDA index, and a series of few more elements that are contextual in terms of humidity and a few more elements. All of this combined with varying degree of weights is what arrives at a final score of risk score at an individual house level on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being a house that is safe, 5 being a house it is at a high risk of imminent damage in the event of a cyclone going through that region. That is what we have done. And Anshu, I remember the conversation we had when 9 out of 10 houses on the ground truthing were like, wow, this was great. If you're able to go to a house and tell them with high certainty that you have to evacuate because your house, though your neighboring house for XYZ reasons is not susceptible, you have to vacate. And one of those conversations where we had realized that the same community in the neighborhood, which our volunteers on the ground had walked in, earlier the warnings in India, the warnings are either by IMD or a Indian Water Commission. At best, the warning that you get is all low-lying areas evacuate. That's it. That's the SMS that you get, nothing beyond this. And from that level to what Anshu was talking about, customized individual house level ability to predict risk. That's the beauty. And one aspect of resilience that I had a good learning was in one of the Cyclone Yaas, when we did the ground truthing, the model had predicted close to 70 plus houses were at risk of 3 or 4. But it turns out that in the ground truthing, those houses were not damaged at all. So when we did the math, the accuracy was lower than the first pass we did in Puducherry and suburbs of Chennai. Then Anshu made a very good observation. What you're worried about is model's accuracy. Think about it this way: though the house was at risk because of the cyclone event and the intensity and landfall change from where it started, it's still a good sign that the house was not damaged, though the risk was high. Those were the kind of improvements that Anshu was referring to. There is still a lot more that can be done from a risk scoring standpoint in terms of accounting for wind speed, accounting for the path of the cyclone, accounting for elevation, different structures. So that's where we are at the moment. Anshu might take a minute or two to give a glimpse of how the model works and where we have been able to create the impact. May I?
Please.
So as part of the overall work, what we have been able to accomplish is a final output of the whole work that has been done for Sunlive's project. The outcome is an application that will be made available to volunteers on the ground where the impact would be assessed. And so far, from the time the project has gone live, we have been able to apply the learnings of the project across the coastal line. We had done work in Pentakata in Puri and the southern states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So if I look at just one representation in Puducherry, and let me just zoom in here to look at a small AOI chip. what we would see is that over the aerial image, that is a recent image which is less than 3 months old, look at this region, which is bang on the coastal line, and this is a heavily residential community in middle of a large area. So what you notice here is that each of the houses rooftops is detected by the model, and when you do a hover over, you would see that each house is assigned an individual risk score. In this case, the house is risk score 2, and the area of that particular house is calculated at 51.67 square meters overall region, while a house next to this, which is a 13 square meter house, it has a risk of 3. So this is a granularity at which individuals could, volunteers could walk around the neighborhood and give them understanding of whether their house is at higher risk or lower risk. This is a representation of how, when the same information is made available over a mobile phone with a GPS enabled tracker, it could be a lot more powerful in terms of alerting individuals. And this solution is what has been put to use, and we have applied this across multiple AOIs. One of the recent ones that we have applied this solution is on Cyclone Yaas, which hit the western coast in the state of Gujarat. This was the last cyclone that we had assessed. Here again, this is a case of how the awareness of the neighborhood and availability of information helped us identify different houses. If you notice here, this essentially is a large neighborhood which is spread across close to the coast as well as interior. And by having an understanding of risk scores, if you notice, houses that are in 3 and 4, which are orange, while some of the houses are in yellow, lower risk, this is the level at which volunteers can optimize their outreach in a neighborhood. That's the power that Anshu was talking about, customized, localized solutions. This solution currently we have applied and tested the model across floods and heat waves. As Anshu mentioned, earthquakes is the next hazard that we are integrating into the overall solution and model. Anshu, any comments on how this solution has shaped up? Anshu, Cameron, Tina, uh, any observations or thoughts?
So if I can jump in just for a minute, Sandeep, the way you've shown this, and thanks for sharing these almost live dashboards that you've put on the screen here. What this visual kind of makes you think is, how is it going to be used in the years to come, and who's going to use it? So this is developing this, bringing the understanding to the table was our domain, but then its deployment is actually a governance issue. It's a risk governance issue. It's to be dealt with. It needs to be owned by government. So the one bit to share is that the focus now this year for us also is to engage very closely with the relevant authorities in government, the disaster management authorities of the states, and the municipalities in the cities where we are working, where this uptake needs to be embedded, not just for emergency response, but also to understand where risk lies, so that in the longer term plans, there can be measures to address this risk. So that's one side. And then when we talk of use cases, which we did a bit when we were talking of hazards and the various vulnerabilities, but then if you start thinking of who else can use it, one of the flagship programs that Seeds has been running for years is a school safety program. Now, imagine the kind of losses that happen in major disasters in schools, school buildings, school communities, teachers, students, and how that can be an audience that can actually put this kind of information to use for assessing risks and being able to take steps around that. So where we see this heading is more of a platform approach, where different use cases, of course, different hazards, but different users can plug in and find the very specific tools that can enable them to be able to prepare better, to be able to respond better, and not just prepare in the short term, but as I was mentioning, prepare in the longer term, so that we can start talking about reducing risk rather than just responding to disasters. Sandeep?
That would be the next that would be the next agenda for a solution like this to be scaled across India. And as you talked about, the vast coastline and state governments getting in and buying into this risk mitigation, risk management. Noted, Anshu. Tina, Cameron, any comments and thoughts on how the final outcome is being made available to use?
No, it's exciting, and it's the direction that we love seeing the work go. It's also where we're looking at a global scale, like this idea now of individualized risk assessment. It's where the sector needs to head, because there's only so many resources, there's only so much you can do. So how do you, as efficiently as possible, tackle it?
Right.
So yeah, no, it's exciting.
Wonderful. And taking it global would be one major milestone for a solution like this. Tina, any remarks from your end?
On our side, from the research lab, we will continue to work to refine the models to help support this platform, which I agree with Cameron. This is all moving in a great direction, and especially with the partnership with Seeds and Anshu and the engagement with across the state governments in India. Looking forward to seeing how this evolves.
Wonderful. And Anshu, you talked about the future potential for a project like this, right, Anshu? How do you see this shaping up in terms of what would be the next problem? 2 years ago, this was the problem that you have conceptualized and looked at as a gap. What would be that next wave of problem areas you think is ripe for disruption? I'm using a cliche from technology world, Anshu, pardon me for that, but my intent was to understand what is the next problem you have your sights on, which we could potentially assist you with solving.
I think instead of trying to identify a new problem, I would say let's unravel more from the current problem that we are looking at. I think Cameron just used the phrase scarce resources. You have that many resources. How do you deploy them better? I think once you have, right now, the design of this model does not even start encountering the problem that resources are going to be scarce. And there's two challenges. One is a rapid change, right? So you may have a satellite image and you may be doing something, but if I'm not wrong, the metros, here, Bombay, Delhi, Dhaka, these cities are growing roughly at about 300 to 400 families a day, right? So even in the next 20 days, you would have added so many people, and most of them would be at the bottom rung. That's where the crux of the vulnerability is lying. So this change is too fast and it's constant. So once you've got a model which is working in a static context, how do you now start responding to a rapid change? How can you be live literally in real time? And the second would be, how do you then start encountering the problem of scarce resources? And the deeper you go, if we call it the bottom 1% that we are trying to reach out to and assist, that's where the resources are at their scarcest. So how do you put these two together is a challenge that I would start looking at rather than newer problems. Sandeep?
Well said, Anshu. We have a set of questions that have come over in the chat, Anshu. May I just go over these? And seems to be one question that is while you have the risk scoring done and the model given intimation to high risk folks, but are people not apprehensive when you tell them that they do not need to evacuate when everyone around you is asked to evacuate? That's a good one from one of the participants.
Yeah, it is. So firstly, no, so far we are not, and certainly not telling anyone not to evacuate. There are government advisories to evacuate, and we are fully aligned to what the government is doing. We are only complementing and supplementing that. So I may have shared that as a capability of the model, but that's not something we are doing on the ground. What we are doing on the ground is helping people evacuate better. So what happens is, as I said, when 1 million people are asked to evacuate, not everybody does. There are people who literally hide. They have to be forced to evacuate, and then still some will run and they will escape and they will hide in places when the police vans and the buses come to evacuate, because they just want to be there. Their boats are on the beach, their nets are there, their houses are there. They don't want to leave, right? So and the fact is that in the past there have been false warnings, or there have been warnings where the impact has not been so great. So people believe that, oh, the government is playing safe, we'll be fine. And what we try to do is we try to bring accuracy to that, and we say that, okay, here's information. So we're carrying maps. We can tell this is your house, right? These parts are okay, but your house is not. So you need to move. So we show them stuff. That's what we were doing this last year. The second thing that's worth sharing here in response to the question is that we don't go as external, informant. So wherever we've done this ground truthing that Sandeep you also spoke about, it's always been done by our local partners. These are local NGOs, volunteer groups who are embedded in these communities. So the trust level is very high, and it's never us from Delhi or anywhere else going and giving this information directly. So there has to be a chain for that communication to happen. It has to be in the local language. It has to come from locally trusted sources. Sandeep?
True, Anshu. While the technology can give an indication, the message has to be delivered by a familiar face, the local one. One other question, Anshu, is have you tried this methodology on other types of disasters like wildfires, for instance? Is that on
So
the radar, Anshu?
it's on the radar. We've conceptually been trying to look at it. In fact, a very interesting program that we've been trying to work on is to look at how wildfires, which are called bushfires in Australia, and we've had major bushfires a couple of years ago in New South Wales. So we were trying to see what's happening in California, what's happening in New South Wales, and what's been happening in the Indian state of Uttarakhand, which is a Himalayan foothill state where we see major forest fires, and they will start in another few weeks from now. And what's interesting is that there are two dimensions to it. One is the fire itself, which may be of great interest, and the model can be customized to meet that need, which is a forestry need and a biodiversity need. But what we are currently looking at, fires that happen around communities, and there is a direct impact risk from the fire itself, and there is an indirect impact from the smoke that comes, and there is an indirect impact from the resultant lockdowns that happen there, where activities have to be stopped. So again, we are approaching it from a vulnerability of people and settlements around it point of view. We still don't have a live application, but I think it's a really good example to take, and thanks for raising this. I think it's something that either us or someone here in this group needs to be working on. Heat, fires, smoke, and pollution, all of these will, and water in that story. These are somewhat tight stories which will, bring up a very ugly face as a collective in the years to come. We need to work on that. Sandeep?
A related question, Anshu. Considering the disparity in education levels and understanding of communication, uh, the question is how do you ensure that the individual household comprehension that we are doing is in communicating the warning messages? Is there a need or is there an intent to differentiate how the message is conveyed? That's a good
Yeah.
one. While our advisories are standardized, how do you
Yeah.
contextualize it for the education level?
No, that's a great question. Thanks for raising this. So, I'll answer it in two parts: the answer part and a further question part. The answer part is that, as I was saying, we always engage through local stakeholders. So it'll be local volunteers, local community organizations. So if you as Sina said, we are on the verge of publishing some of this work, and as you will see, a lot of these warnings are graphic. Like I was showing my hand, and Sandeep was showing his. So we literally have a map, and we have sketches, and we have diagrams. So it's not a written warning. It's either a verbal warning, but then we can't show the physicality of what we've studied. So it's volunteers going around and showing people stuff, putting little sticky posters on walls, and that's how we are doing it. So it's taken away from that literacy part. That's the easy part of it. The more challenging part of it is not just about education and disparities in educational levels. There's more about perception. It's about risk perception, and some of us see something as risky, and others don't. Every individual, every family, every community has a different risk perception level and threshold beyond which they will act, and that's a universal fact. So now you're entering the space of human psychology on how people perceive risk and how they react to it, and that disparity is much wider. So
Right.
a fishing community which is used to going out in rough seas on a boat does not get scared of storm surges the way I do. uh, but then
True.
what we need to understand is that these are also very traditional communities. In most of these communities, many of you may not know, it's taboo for women to go and swim and be in the sea. So while they spend their entire lives living at the edge of the sea, most women do not know how to swim. And that's why in past cyclones, we've seen casualties in women and children have been very high wherever there's been a storm surge or a boat capsize, because the men can swim to safety and the women can't. So, there are these very invisible disparities that we are struggling with. So that's where a lot more needs to be done. So the question remains very valid. And in fact, it's far more complicated than you posed it, but thanks for raising it. Sandeep?
Sure. Sure. Tina, a question that has come on the model. How easy or challenging would it be to adapt the model to newer hazards?
To adapt it to.
Newer hazard, like now we looked at floods. We want to deploy the model on a different type of hazard
So I
from a
think
data standpoint.
yeah, so I think applying to different hazards, it would be a combination of both the machine learning model built by the AI for Good Research Lab, and then the risk model built by Gramener, since they work together. Depending on the hazard and the location of the hazard, where that machine learning model would be useful is if we're looking at different house types against the hazard. So it would, so for instance, when you referenced fires, looking at the house types and retraining a model for that region and that type against what your risks are with the fire, and that would go to combining with the risk scoring model from Gramener. So it would be a combination of both pieces, but the full pipeline that would need to be adjusted.
That's helpful. So far, I just want to call out some of these questions came from Janice from Compassion Canada, and we have Lena from UNICEF who have joined in and asked these questions. The last question, Anshu, I'll request you to weigh in. When you talk about rather than focusing on incident response alone, is there merit in doing a high-risk scoring for qualification of infra grants, for example? Is there potential to extend this to enabling granting of infra grants? That's a beautiful question. Definitely something which I haven't looked at. So Anshu, what do you think?
No, I agree. It's a really good question. It's very thought provoking. Thanks again for sharing this. Sayantan, who's shared this, I think raised the question. The I think it's really valid. So far, what Tina was just explaining and where we were trying to distinguish when we talk about hazards, that we are deploying this on, and then we are talking about a risk scoring. The difference that we take in our approach moving from a hazard to a risk score, risk will have an element of vulnerability built into it. So most model, why this work probably hasn't happened so far, is that the focus has been on the hazard side. You are trying to forecast uh, events that are going to happen. You're trying to calibrate the intensity and the spread of events that will unfold, cyclones or floods or earthquakes. The problem that people face on the ground is not because of the event, it is because of the inherent vulnerability in the buildings. And your question helps us extend that to infrastructure. So it's not just houses, it would be true for a primary health center, it is true for hospitals, it is true for schools. A hospital that fails in a disaster is the most expensive hospital because it did not work the day it was meant to be at peak performance, right? And that happens across the board. Every single disaster you see hospital failures happening. So, and that's a big one, but your question probably also does refer to very small local infrastructure, which could be and again, to share an example, same place, Puri, 2019, same cyclone. The cyclone pulled down electric poles and electric lines in the thousands. So for a month, there was no power in the city of Puri. Because there was no power, the water pumping station did not work. So there was no water in the taps. and the storm surge had already made all the drinking water sources saline, including the hand pumps, because the seawater had gone in, those surface water was gone. So, there's this cascading effect which you don't see, you don't read it in the news, it doesn't make it to the headlines, there are no pictures of this, but that's where people struggle. So I'm only saying this in support of the idea that has been floated, that yes, certainly there can be infra grants, there can be community level infra insurance put in place, there can be infra backups and infra support that can be planned for emergency on this, and a lot more can be done there. I think we are right now at the very beginning, baby steps, looking at houses and families, but I think this is a great question to start winding this up with. But this is what's kind of opening the doors and showing us where all we can go with this, how many use cases can emerge from this initial thinking. And I think between with the muscle that Microsoft brings and Gramener brings, with Gramener, Microsoft, and Seeds, all of this is completely going to be beyond our scope. So this is where we need a lot more organizations, individuals, academic institutions, corporations, governments to pitch in and make things happen on this. And it'll be really fulfilling to see these use cases, come to life in the years to come. Sandeep?
So well said, Anshu. I'll take the last question, Anshu. How can the model be employed to mitigate flood disasters in the first place? And I'm presuming, similar to the infra grants question, the risk scoring could be used in building permissions to some extent, enable the decision of should we even grant construction of a building in this region in a low-lying community in those lines.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, Sandeep. So if we see from the governance and controls and compliance side, then there could be more regulations. We could say what you can do and what you can't do. If you look at it from the community side, and I'd like to underscore that most of these families that we try to go and assist are below that formal radar. So a lot of these are in the informal sector, a lot of these are quasi-legal, a lot of them are actually on the record, they're illegal settlers because they don't have tenurial rights on the land. So, but here what we can beyond this do is, when you talk of mitigating flood disasters, you could, a simple thing like the inundation map that results from the digital elevation model that you spoke about, Sandeep and Tina. So there is no local perception of that. And one of the things we do, I think in some of our communication material, there are these images where we just erect, wherever we're working, we erect a concrete pole which we mark as a scale. And then when we talk of a so the flood forecasts come in meters, which are mean sea level. They are not relative to your house, because your house could be at any elevation. We don't know what elevation it is, right? So now if there's a 300-meter warning, then we can install this in your neighborhood and we can say, hey, when it's 300 meter, it's actually going to be here exactly. So that'll be on the third step of the temple, but hey, Sandeep, it's going to be like a foot of water in your house, but in Anshu Sharma's house is going to be 7 feet of water, right? So that relative understanding comes, which may tell me that, boss, instead of expanding horizontally, I need to expand vertically. I need an attic, right? If nothing else, if I can't add a floor, I mean, attics are beautiful mitigation measures in houses for poor people, where they can at least save some of their stuff. There have been so many stories of where kids are put on the attics and people climb up and they're able to save. There have been aerial images of so many people who take refuge on their rooftop. So this can tell you where you need to find access beyond a certain level and where you need to evacuate. So in the longer run, yes, if you're talking of mitigation, there can be controls, but there can also be pathways shown where safer built environment can be put in place. Sandeep?
Wonderful, Anshu. I know we have extended beyond our scheduled time. So Anshu, Tina and Cameron, thank you so much for taking your time and relishing what we have been able to accomplish collectively in the last 1 year on Sunlight's project. I also want to acknowledge Nasir from the Microsoft Data Science team, Mridula from the Seeds team, Raghav from the Seeds team, Kaustubh, Sumed and Soumyaranjan from the Gramener team, who are not part of the panel, but these are the people who were instrumental in getting this whole project to see the day of light. And collectively, Anshu, we wish we would join with you on the next journey. As Cameron talked about, this is the kind of example that Seeds has set on how do you do a good gap analysis and enable the action through technology. So we'd be looking forward to more such journeys with you, Anshu. And thank you all for making time and joining us for this webinar. If you have any further questions and you'd want us to answer those questions, please feel free to reach out over email, which you would be seeing in the follow-up communication that you would get from our end. Thank you all, and have a good day ahead.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Pleasure.